Your wish list to Santa. So Santa, this is the Ukraine that I would like to see when the war is over.
Ukraine, like I said, with many different voices that can tell their stories. A Ukraine where coexistence is possible, where different when we can talk about our pain freely without being censored, and we can also talk about each other without stereotypes and without falling back on the old Soviet narratives, because that also influences a lot in our discourse. And of course, just the Ukraine that's blossoming, that's flourishing, where you can discover many new artists, many new voices, and it's extraordinary that you can do it now. But to see that even more and even outside the borders of Ukraine, that's my wish too. I think I would like Ukraine to be known on its own, not in relationship to Russia.
Hello and welcome back to this, our first episode of On the Edge following our winter holiday hiatus. Our guest is Victoria Belim, and she was born in this country, but at a relatively early age, she moved to the United States, to Chicago to be precise. Then a little bit later down the road with her husband, she moved to Western Europe, to Belgium. And that allowed her also then to travel back to the country of her birth, to get reacquainted with it, culture, society, history, but also in particular her own family. And that gives her a relatively unique perspective as both an outsider and an insider. So just the kind of person that we need to be talking to. And we discuss so many things about Ukraine and her family, its tragic past, warts and all, for better or worse. But we also talk about the kind of country that the people of this land, these Ukrainians, want to build. So, Victoria Belim, thank you very much for coming and speaking to us today. You are the author of a book called The Rooster House, and it documents your return to your homeland. You were born here in Ukraine. You moved away when you were 15 to Chicago, but eventually found your way back to Ukraine to reunite with your family, to reunite with your country, and things like that. And I don't want to give too much away about the book, because I'd like people to read the book. But I think it's worth mentioning one thing about it is the title, The Rooster House, because it's based in a city called Poltava, where your family is from. And the Rooster House was where the Soviet secret police would conduct their interrogations, would conduct torture, would do all these kind of things. And I mention this because I want my audience to understand that in this country there is a legacy of torture and cruelty and trauma that's been inflicted upon itself by an imperial master in Moscow. How much does trauma define Ukraine and Ukrainians, do you think?
Well, I think that's a very good way of putting it, because actually starting our conversation from trauma is a very good entry point into understanding Ukrainian identity and the context of the war today, and also the way Ukraine is living through it. Because, of course, if you look at Ukraine's history traditionally, there is, it's a country that's, I know some people may not like it. It's a borderland. But for me, borderland is actually a very interesting place, because borderland, and I think about this term the way late historian Tony Judd used to define it. Borderland is the place where several different trade routes cross, where different empires meet, where different people meet, where different ideas come together and create something new and original and very interesting. So before going into trauma, I would like to also mention this fact, because Ukraine as a place, it's not basically a backyard of something. It's its own place with its really incredible, rich and layered culture. And I think the very reason I ended up writing my book, I started working on this book in 2014 after Maidan, which actually was kind of this cataclysm for me. For me, in many ways, 2014 was an even more tragic, even more kind of watershed moment than 2022, because I was more or less prepared for 2022, but for 2014, for 2013-14, I was in no way prepared. And if we talk about trauma, of course, it just exists on so many levels, on so many layers in our identity. The fact that I, who grew up with great-grandparents and grandparents who knew Holodomor and famine, and I never knew hunger, and yet in my home in Brussels, I have this big stockpile of just about everything that I need to survive. When we first started living with my husband, he thought it was just absolutely insane. But then he ended up just accepting it, because he's like, oh, she was born in the Soviet Union. But it's not that. It's not the Soviet Union so much. It's more of that inherited trauma. In Ukraine, we always come back a lot to the question of Holodomor. In every country, there is a defining tragedy. In Belgium, for instance, it's the First World War. And in Ukraine, it's Holodomor. And torture by starvation is really the most cruel and the most traumatic torture for the survivors and their descendants, because it leaves it's on such a primal level.
Yeah.
You can't even explain it. You have no words for it. But really, it's it becomes clear once you talk to people, once you start, especially someone like me, who's a political scientist by training and who worked as a journalist for many years. In doing interviews, I always notice these elements, and of course, studying my own family history, trying to make sense of it, to understand it, I realize, just every single conversation starts with some sort of unresolved pain, unresolved loss. When you cannot talk about it, it becomes even worse. Because despite the fact that we often hear, time heals all wounds, time heals nothing unless something is resolved, unless something is talked about, discussed, made public, and people have a chance to process it somehow. It never goes away.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I it's interesting you mentioned 2014, because I was here then as well. And I think in many ways, Maidan was the buildup from all of this trauma. And it was released in this chaotic, violent way. I mean, Maidan was a violent event, but it was, to me, also the culmination of the trauma. And it was almost one of the things that I have noticed, and I have spoken to many of my guests who are Ukrainian, because I remember a time in Ukraine before Maidan. I remember the 90s. I remember, the early thousands and the Orange Revolution and all the rest of it. Maidan to me was this moment where Ukraine and Ukrainians crossed a line that they can't uncross. And that was no more trauma, no more abuse by our neighbors, no more letting other nations define us. We're going to define ourselves. In short, it was the breaking of the colonial mentality. And I don't think that genie can be put back in the box. Moscow clearly doesn't understand that and is trying to do that with violence. But did you get the same sense? You say that Maidan was different than 2022. We all knew the Russians were coming. I had little old ladies on Maidan in 14 begging me not to forget Ukraine because the Russians will come for us. No surprise. But 2014, I agree with you. I think it was a breaking point for Ukrainian mentality and the breaking of the chains of colonization. Did you get the same sense? What sense did you get from what changed on Maidan?
Well, I will explain how Maidan changed me and my own identity, because I grew up in a family which was very mixed. We have basically many different nationalities, ethnicities, whatever you call it, in our family. And I did not grow up with a very strong Ukrainian identity, you could say. It was just a regular, Soviet family. And but my great-grandparents, they spoke Ukrainian to us, and they taught Ukrainian language and history and literature at a small school near Poltava, in the suburb of Poltava, and that was my kind of my most Ukrainian of experiences. So for me, in some ways, I often defined myself less as a Ukrainian, more as a Poltavska, someone from Poltava, because that was more, something that made sense to me. And so when I came to the States, I was 15, and I immediately wanted to understand this new and fascinating country. I wanted to meet different people. I found it so exciting that people could come from all over the world. And in my classroom, there were people from so many different countries. And that's what I wanted. And I think it really... I even made my parents Americans as a result, because I said, no, we're going to celebrate Thanksgiving. And, and they were, what is this holidays even about? What are we supposed to be thankful for? But, and so for many years, I did not define myself as a Ukrainian or anything other than American. And I quickly became American because also, frankly, in the 90s, it was very easy to become assimilated and feel American. And for my parents, it was like that. So for us, it was a very positive, very, uplifting experience in many ways. Mm-hmm. And I think when my husband and I moved to Belgium, it was 2013, if I'm not mistaken. And at first it was just for a couple of years for work, but we have been there since and not planning to leave. In Belgium, I suddenly felt, well, am I still American? Because of course, in Western Europe, you suddenly feel, your different parts of your identity kind of become highlighted as a contrast to the local culture. And then 2013 is happening, Maidan is happening, and that pushes me to really wonder, what am I? Who am I? Why is Ukraine coming back to me so strongly? Why is everything that's happening in Ukraine feels almost this physical level, physical pain? And And almost immediately I decided I'll go back to Ukraine. My grandmother, Valentina, was still alive and she lived near Poltava. So I bought a ticket and I came for these 90 days that, the visa-free status allows me to stay here in the country. And at first, it was just simply to be with my grandmother and trying to make sense of everything that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So I come back to Ukraine after this long hiatus. And of course, it's a very different country from what I left. It's, on the one hand, extremely modern and very, exciting, and new things are happening. It's very dynamic culturally and on many different levels. And at the same time, it's also exciting because I'm discovering Ukraine as an adult. I already have experience living in the United States, in Belgium, working in different countries in Asia, Japan, Singapore, etc. So I discover my country as an adult. Mm. And what I discover, I find that it's absolutely incredible. This culture is just so rich. Yes, trauma is an important element, and this element of pain, of suffering, sometimes this unjust suffering, unjust victimhood. Victimhood, yeah, it does exist. But next to it exists this extremely dynamic, new and fresh way of trying to define ourselves. And so for me, that was extremely exhilarating, thrilling.
So you come back almost as a foreigner in some ways, and you reacquaint yourself with the country of your birth, and it's exhilarating. What was shocking? What was negative? You very well described the excitement, because I remember that period too. Mm-hmm. And I still think that there is that happening now, even during this current trauma, that there is also a sense of, for the first time in centuries, we are Ukraine. We have our own story to tell, and we will tell it, and we're going to build this thing that has been denied us and repressed for centuries. And that is exhilarating, you're right. But there's also some ugly things and some shocking things and things that make things. There are some very strong difficulties here as well. What were the difficulties and the things that shocked you when you returned?
I'm trying to think of the one thing that really stood out to me because, of course, there are many things that in many ways I am much more American in my mentality, in my approach to things, to people, to relationships than I am Ukrainian. But at the same time, I understand the local context and I can sort of figure out sometimes things that, almost on the subconscious level. And of course, the most negative thing that I remember observing is basically this very combination of fatalism with a very Soviet approach to things, where people see themselves not as active agents with free will, but as part of some sort of machine. And I remember talking to a young man, and he says something like, how did he put it? Oh, I'm either cannon meat or a taxpayer, and nothing else. And I thought, no, you're not. You're a writer, you are an artist, just why is the state making you feel this way? Why do you feel this way? And he could not even explain why exactly. So it's not to say that his feeling was baseless, but the fact that he said it so confidently and so quickly without thinking about it further made me wonder. And this is also, part of the Soviet trauma. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, in a Soviet state, as in any repressive dictatorial system, an individual does not have free will. An individual is part of the machine. Individual has certain role to play. And if that's how people see themselves, then it can be very negative, because you end up missing out on opportunities to make changes in the system when you could speak out, when you could do something instead of saying, well, I cannot do anything anyway, and I might as well just worry about my day-to-day existence.
Less involvement with the government, the better, frankly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that is very much a holdover from, and I'm not excusing Ukrainian agency. Ukrainians are responsible for their own actions. You can't have it both ways. You can't say you were fighting for Ukrainian agency and then say all of our problems are because of Moscow. No, it's not that simple. But in this case, I do think that this is a legacy of Moscow because I am speaking more and more to Ukrainians who are politically involved. They vote. They're concerned about political issues. They take to the streets to protest, not just Maidan, but we have protests happening right now, during the war, and there's controversy and political involvement. So I think I see a change in Ukrainians when it comes to this mentality of like, I'm either going to just, be grist for the mill or, I'm just be the silent man instead the gray man. Nobody notices me. That's what the Soviet system, that's what the Moscow system wants you to be. But I see a change happening in Ukraine in that I think people are gaining agency, and I think people are looking at themselves as citizens, participants. I don't know if you see that same change happening or not, or how your perspective is on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We could see during the protest against NABU,
which is this anti-corruption
law, we see these, the basically grassroots mobilization at many different levels. To the same extent that we don't see it, for instance, in Russia, where, of course, the system is much more centralized, much more repressive, but it also has to do part with the mentality, and culture of political participation. In Ukraine, it's very different. Ukraine is much more unpredictable because we end up acting and sometimes very spontaneous and very strong actions when we don't, others don't expect them. And the way our political system is structured, it also absorbs it, and it does not necessarily completely break under it. So, and that's healthy. That kind of engagement is very healthy because we cannot give away all the powers to the government, and there has to be accountability and responsibility. Of course, the accountability is something that absolutely requires lots more work. Ukraine does have an issue with corruption, as we all know, and it's some of it is definitely legacy of the Soviet system in the way that resources were concentrated and channeled. So, but we also cannot explain everything by the Soviet past or by the, presence of Russia at our borders. Although in some sense, I would take an issue with calling Russia an empire because the way Russia acts, the way it behaves, it falls more under the model of kind of Oriental despotism, Asian despotism, and rather than a classical empire. But it does not change the facts on the ground because the repressive apparatus inside the country and kind of the lack of freedom and basically its effect spreads out.
I had a very, very interesting conversation one time with a professor, a Ukrainian history professor in Lviv. And I asked him, where is this divergence between Russian identity and Ukrainian identity? Where do things separate? And he said a couple of things, but one of the things that I think is relevant to our conversation now is that Russia, Muscovy, became multi-ethnic by conquest. It grew out and absorbed other cultures, and that's how it grew. That's how its strength grew, and that's how it became quote unquote multi-ethnic, multicultural. Ukraine, by contrast, became multicultural and multi-ethnic because other empires came in and moved through, and then they left their remnants, and then people of different ethnic groups, religions, remnants of empire, they had to learn how to talk to one another and to make an agreement. So it wasn't conquest, it was coming to an agreement. So there is a foundation for democracy in Ukraine that you just don't see in Russia, because the way they became multicultural and multi-ethnic are very different, and the ramifications of these two different histories, which I felt was fascinating and I think is 100% true. There's also the point that there's been divide and conquer in Ukraine. Another friend of mine tells me, put two Ukrainians in a room and you'll have three arguments. There's a lot of diversity here, but there is also a willingness to work together to make this multi-ethnic, multicultural country called Ukraine, which hasn't existed in a very long time. And what is the identity of a Ukrainian? And I think that's being developed now. You're here now, a native Ukrainian. You're watching your country go through another major change in its history. Do you think Ukrainians will stay together? Do you think that they will, work it out? Democracies can be ugly things and messy things. Do you think Ukraine's up to the task?
Ukraine already has shown that it's up to the task, that it can hold these differences together. How that becomes a question, because, we have also another legacy of the Soviet way of talking about history, where, history was meant to suit a certain type of ideology. And any type of history that would not conform to that ideology was discarded or labeled regressive, backward, etc., or simply false. So we have to be careful now that we don't fall into that trap again, where we have to allow people with different histories to be able to share their story. Because, of course, as someone, I spent now since 2022, I've started coming back to Ukraine since August 2024. I've spent already 8 months in Ukraine total. So almost a year. And I spent this time essentially in the east. Mm-hmm. So by that I mean Kharkiv, Sumy, and then a little bit of the Donetsk region.
Along the front line area.
Along the front line, yes. Because in some ways, that's the... when I first would come back to Ukraine in 2014, I would always gravitate towards the West because it seemed more exotic to me at the time. But now I feel kind of the pull of the East, and because one, it's really fascinating region in general. It's very diverse, it's very complex, and even inside Ukraine, it's not appreciated how diverse and complex it is. I mean, if we talk about Lugansk and Donetsk regions, it's very different, based on different types of industry, different types of, social relations. And Donetsk alone, that region is also comprised of 3 different parts. If you talk about Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, that's a little bit closer to the Slobozhanщина. That's part of the Kharkiv region in mentality, in the way the cities are organized and culture. You go further east or south, again, landscape changes, industry changes, and also people and the kind of social makeup changes a lot. And that's just one region.
Mm-hmm.
You could travel in Kharkiv and go to different villages and find yourself discovering different types of dialects, different types of culture, artisanal work, and also a legacy of empire building by Russia, but also the legacy of the way Ukraine was building itself. Because, of course, we can say that Ukraine, as a modern state, has a short existence, but it's not quite true. It's also a little bit of a complicated case here because, Ukraine as an idea is much longer, and Ukraine as a state is, as an idea, is even longer still. So you find elements of it as you travel. For instance, just a week ago, I went in the Kharkiv region, basically in the Kupiansk direction, and found a village there, Korobochkine, which is fascinating because it's mostly a military settlement from 19th century, essentially, and where people speak a dialect which is not quite modern Russian and not quite standard Ukrainian, but its own language, which is very distinctive.
Is this kind of similar to Sujuk?
It's, well, you could say it's Surzhyk. Surzhyk is just a Creole mix, but there it even has even more dialectical words in it. And I found it quite fascinating. So these villages where people know they're called Russian village or Ukrainian village, but not in terms of political affiliation, but in terms of the original settlements.
Right.
And these Russian and Ukrainian villages, they are just defining themselves that way. But, politically and in terms of identity, they still belong to modern Ukraine, and they're pro-Ukrainian.
Yeah. And they may speak Russian, but they're still, I know so many. Kharkiv is a Russian-speaking city, but I would challenge anybody to say that they're pro-Russian just because they happen to speak Russian.
True. Of course, since 2022, Kharkiv became much more Ukrainian-speaking. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean just the people switching to Ukrainian as a conscious choice, but also because there is a big influx of population.
This is true too, yes.
Fleeing the fighting. Yeah. So that changes the makeup of the city and also the language that it speaks. But in many ways, the language is a very sensitive issue in Ukraine, as you know. But on some level, it's also a little bit exaggerated because for many people, language does not necessarily define their political choices. Mm-hmm. And in Ukrainian, the bilingual existence is basically, it's not the case of Belgium, for instance, in where I live and where sometimes Belgium is brought up to me as an example of how Ukraine can be. And I say, I hope not, because Belgium is a very dysfunctional case, not just linguistically speaking. But in Ukraine, I remember even in 2014, when I first started coming back and paying attention to the language issues, because in 2014, that's when I decided to switch to Ukrainian as my day-to-day language. Mm-hmm. For some people in my family, it happened in 2022, but for me, it was in 2014. And frankly speaking, Ukrainian in 2014 in Kyiv was really challenging because people did not switch to Ukrainian and often made it clear that they did not like it. Of course, it changed over time.
Yeah.
But I also remember noticing how people would use two languages simultaneously.
Oh, yes, I've noticed that too, yeah.
Even on TV. And Timothy Snyder, who who observed this really, really well. He said that, just the bilingual nature of coexistence in Ukraine is just basically on totally different level. It cannot be compared to anything.
He is my white whale as a guest for this show. I would love to talk to him about some of this stuff and I chuckle a little bit when you talk about identity and this sense of Ukraine defining its own identity now. And I chuckle a little bit because, of course, I've got on my shelf, I've got Kobzar, by Shevchenko, and I've got my doll up there, and all there's a lot of identity and culture and that's been repressed, now has a chance to flourish. And I chuckle because I don't know too many national anthems that start with the statement of the dream of this country is not yet dead. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But the first stanza of the Ukrainian national anthem is, we're not done. We're not dead. We're not forgotten. We are Ukraine. The dream of Ukraine is not yet dead. So I see this historic thing happening here, which, being American, I also see as part of my history and my legacy of a colony breaking away from its imperial master and then having to decide who it is. That, once you break away from the imperial master, then you're on your own. Then you have to decide who you are. With this current trauma, we've talked a lot about trauma in Ukraine, but this is a current trauma that a lot of people currently are trying to kind of repress in many ways, I think. Yes, they're dealing with psychological issues better than perhaps they may have done in the past, like with suicide hotlines or, mental health facilities. But there's still a trauma that is currently, I think, being desperately repressed. You hear the arguments of like, oh, look at those people at the cafes in a war-torn Ukraine, or kids going to bars and parties and clubs and things like that. But to me, I think this is a desperate effort to repress the pain of this current trauma. When this war is over, with the trauma that is gone through all of your history, the Holodomor in particular, but colonization, and now this current war, which is so devastating and has been going on for so long, and we're all suffering. How do you think this trauma will inform the Ukraine that you're going to have to build once you're free of the empire? The repercussions of it are massive. And because consider it, it's not just 2022. In Ukraine, basically, since 2014, people have not had like a long period of time where they could just work, earn money, study, because every few years something is happening. Mm-hmm. Maidan, the economic crisis, COVID, Maidan and, Crimea, the ATO. The political interference.
Yeah, political
corruption.
Interference, which is a long and really painful process. Then, of course, the pandemic, that for the whole world, it's a major trauma. Just look at the statistics of mental disorders and inability of especially young people to socialize, etc. So that also exists here in Ukraine. And then you add the war, the full-scale invasion in 2022, which once again creates displacement, internal displacement, brain drain, difficulty with continuing education. The schools, it's something on this trip especially, I've been studying and researching this topic a lot. How can you give education to children? How do you maintain the standard of education? How do you socialize children? Because offline is really the best way to educate anyone. Mm-hmm. Online has its limits, and we can see that. So unfortunately, there's not one answer. But then, of course,
Well, and you're turning bomb shelters into schools now.
Into schools or metros.
That's going to form that generation's sense of self and relationship with education and knowledge.
And consider the fact that many educational facilities in Ukraine have been targeted. Purposely. Because, for instance, I traveled in places like Balaklia, Pechenigi, and you see the schools there that have been targeted multiple times until they have been destroyed. Because that's the way to push the population of the area. If children cannot go to school, if their parents cannot assure safety for their children and continuing education, of course they will leave the area. And that makes the front, the situation much more dire and much more complicated to hold on to these areas. And communities as well, along with their culture, as long as their local lore. So, and in terms of trauma, well, of course, the soldiers who are serving, and also many of them that have been mobilized since 2022 and are still serving, and with no clear window of when they could.
And very little rotation, so they're constantly under pressure.
Yes, and since you travel to the front lines, for yourself, you spend even a limited amount of time in that context. And coming back to regular life is extremely traumatic. Every time I come back to Brussels, or basically it takes me longer and longer to adjust to normality. Mm-hmm. I mean, Brussels is such a surreal, absurd town in many ways that, normality there is a very relative term. Wow. But even so, I find that for at least a couple of weeks, I'm completely socially maladjusted person who cannot hold a normal conversation that does not say something that shocks normal people's sensibility. My sense of humor is extremely dark, and I find it extremely difficult to keep in touch with, even now, with anyone who's not my immediate family. And that's someone who does not live here permanently, who just comes, for a couple of months at a time. And imagine, if you have to live in this in these circumstances under this so much pressure. And this neurological contrast effect is it's a serious thing, because when you are in an unsafe, dangerous environment, your time compresses, it feels dense, your focus is extremely narrowed. Your attention is so vigilant. You're focusing, you're reading signs around you because the smallest observation can be your chance to survive in this extreme condition. When you come back in an environment where you don't need to do this, your mental faculties just don't have time to adjust. And that creates lots of issues.
Well, and we're surrounded by pain.
And we're surrounded by pain.
We're surrounded by pain. You walk down the streets of any city in Ukraine, whether it's close to the front line or not, and you see men without legs, or you see women weeping on the phone. You don't have to ask why that limb is missing, and you don't have to ask why she's crying on the phone. You know it's connected. You drive from village to village, and every village has new graves. So we're surrounded by pain. here in Ukraine, and you can't escape it, even if, you may not be in a frontline city, but it's everywhere. And then the sirens go off and the stress begins. And it's sometimes I live in a relatively safe city. Kyiv is well defended by air defense, but we still get those air raid sirens. And when the air raid sirens start, there's a psychological reaction. I'm trying to get to the point of all of this, the history of the trauma and the trauma we're going through now. How much do you think that's going to inform the kind of nation that will exist and the culture and the people when, as all wars do, this war ends? What's your country going to look like?
This is very difficult to answer in one way because it's ongoing, and because right now I personally don't see an easy resolution, because Russia will not give up its imperial ambitions, whatever is the outcome of the current peace talks. And I don't see right now a mechanism that pushes them to do that. And we will simply continue to absorb this trauma. Basically, how the scenario is that this trauma is absorbed and basically comes back to haunt us inside our country, inside our political institutions, our cultural institutions. But that is also, a normal process to deal with something that's so difficult and unresolvable. I feel that if you compare Ukraine with many other countries that have history of these unresolved traumas, then you find that basically there are different ways to adjust it. One, it gets absorbed into the culture, becomes kind of one of the cultural markers, and there is this element of pain and suffering to the art, for instance, that emerges, and that can emerge in many different ways. And it might also get channeled into this new creativity, trying to figure out, because you cannot live with this pain constantly. You have to exist. When people, for instance, show, cafes being full or people going to concerts, it's not because Ukrainians are some, divine like titans that basically are resilient. I actually hate this word resilience. Yeah. It's so overused that it means absolutely nothing in this context. Frankly, most of the time, you don't have any choice. If I've been in Kharkiv for more than a month doing a fellowship at the Literature Museum. And so I've kind of learned how to live and exist in that city. And sometimes it becomes a little bit amusing. I meet foreign journalists and they say things like, oh, life in Kharkiv went underground. And I said, show me that underground, because, I feel that life is everywhere and people are basically not even heeding the sirens or any warnings, not because, they're reckless, but because it gets so exhausting to live in constant vigilance. And yes, you become a little bit fatalistic. Your calculation of risk changes. You also develop this kind of strange metaphysical way of thinking about it. And it's just adjustment to a totally abnormal situation that's been going on too long.
Well, this is another important point that I always try to bring to my audiences and to people who are asking me about what it's like to be here, and when this kind of, as you say, resilience. Oh, the Ukrainians are so resilient. I don't disagree. I agree with what you're saying about the semantics of the word kind of losing any meaning because it's used so flippantly. But I think there's another aspect to it, and I wonder if you would like to respond to this also, is that everything is so abnormal. And anything that's normal, you hold on to that with both hands as hard as you can, because it's the only thing that keeps you sane. And going out, so when I hear these arguments of, we're giving Ukrainians billions of dollars and they're going out and having nightclubs and parties and things like that, my response to that is always, you don't see the desperation there, do you? You don't see how much they need something normal. And going out to a nightclub and dancing for a few hours to forget about the fact that your brother has been on the front line and you haven't heard from him in 6 months. I don't see that as celebration. I see that as desperation. There's a deep sadness beneath it all. It's a facade that people are desperately trying to hold on to something normal. I wonder if you get that same impression from your fellow Ukrainians.
Absolutely. A part of it is that the only way you can exist in a situation that puts so much pressure on you physically, mentally, economically, is that you basically give up the illusion of control and you live day by day.
Mm-hmm.
For me, for instance, even in some challenging circumstances, what grounds me is my work, my writing, books, going out and, taking photos of nature, flowers, or something like this, something very animals, and things like that. Of course, seeing friends, going to a museum, it becomes kind of making a cup of tea and just enjoying a cup of tea, not thinking about anything else. And for many of my friends all over Ukraine, it's the same, finding these kind of rituals or, going for yoga, for a massage. I remember when I was in Kramatorsk, it was just recently, the city is constantly attacked. The artillery is working. And in that situation, you'd think, these things become so frivolous and irrelevant. But they're not. Life goes on in these really unexpected and sometimes beautiful ways. When I visited Sumy, I have a friend who lives in Sumy and who has a perfume boutique. And when I came to that perfume boutique, I thought that we'll have a cup of tea and chat. But there were so many people coming in to buy perfumes that we basically, or just to select, just to smell something beautiful, that we had no time to even talk. And that flow of people was teenagers, grandparents, fashionable young ladies, military men, and women. And it was just basically the cross-section of the entire population in the city. And you would think, okay, this is a perfume boutique selling actually quite expensive perfumes. But, it's full of clients and curious. So it's, I don't know if desperation is the best explanation for it, but I think anyone who lived through war would say that you basically need to some sort of routine and some sort of adjustment. For instance, here in Ukraine, plans rarely get changed because, there is an attack, unless it's something that's really major and, just things can't be done logistically because of that. Mm-hmm. If in 2000 to even 2023 it happened, now it's less so. People kind of learn to carry on.
Yeah, the biggest thing is the electricity. That's the one thing that it is very much a variable, and messes with your life. It makes it very difficult to plan and things like that. I get your point about maybe it's not just desperation, although I do think there is this real need.
Desperation to cling on to the normalcy in a totally abnormal situation.
But also that there is also this element that I see in that, fuck you. I'm not going to let you take this from me. I'm not going to let you take my life away from me. So if me going to the perfume store makes my life normal for 15 minutes, that's 15 minutes the Russians haven't stolen from me. I get a lot of that. I get a lot of talk from Ukrainians that I know who say, this is my form of resistance. This is how I'm not going to let them destroy my life, control my life, disrupt my life. I'm going to live in spite of that. So I think there's both this desperation of like needing normalcy, and there's also this very strong, I know you don't like resilience, let's say resistance to letting the Russians destroy your life. It's getting harder and harder to do that. But I do still think that it's a big part of Ukrainian identity. So as we wrap up here, and I thank you so much for your time, and we have a couple more topics I'd like to talk about. But two questions that are involved in what we've already been discussing is, what is Ukraine without Russia? What is Ukraine without being a colony? I often make the equation, and my Irish friends hate me for it, but I do still make the equation, or the equivalency rather, of the Irish colony when it broke away from Britain. And to this day, there are still some things that are a remnant of being a colony. Ukraine is going to be an independent sovereign nation. That is going to happen at the end of this war. There will be a country called Ukraine. But my question to you is, without the constant pressure, presence, control, obstruction, interference, violence, cruelty, whatever you want to say from Moscow, what is Ukraine without Russia?
What it has been, we cannot speak in hypotheticals because, like I said, I am, as someone who was trained by historians, not to think of history in hypotheticals, but to look at the facts on the ground. For instance, my first book, The Rooster House, what it was about is just basically, it's not about 2022 because the book was finished well before. But what it is, it explains the context and it explains the culture and the self-identity of Ukraine. So when we talk about Ukraine, we have to understand that with Russia, without Russia, that's almost irrelevant. Russia is not going anywhere. And Ukraine is not an island. And there is no Great Wall separating Ukraine from Russia. So some sort of coexistence will have to develop. And hopefully it will be a coexistence and not kind of unilateral push to submit. But Ukraine has been building its culture, its identity for centuries, with Russia, without Russia, in many different ways. For me, my own ideal version of Ukraine is a place that knows that coexistence, this perfect, ideal borderland, and I mean borderland in the most positive of senses, a place where different ideas meet and coexist, where tolerance is not just kind of a nice politically correct term, but where just the mode of life, because there is no other way. And in Ukraine, for instance, you do see that because from different strains of cultural identities, different voices, different languages, different dialects, different arts, it has flourished here sometimes in easier circumstances, sometimes in more difficult ones, and it will continue to do so. We also now have 8 million of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine, and I feel that that diaspora is also very important to engage so that they remain connected to Ukraine, because Ukraine does not have traditionally a very clear-cut relationship with its diaspora. But these people have been instrumental throughout Ukrainian history, also preserving Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian voice. And
we wouldn't have Shadrach if it wasn't for Ukrainian touring companies trying to tell other people who we are, these Ukrainians. The chorus of the bells, it having just been the holiday season. You've heard it many, many times. The choir of the bells. You know that it was a Ukrainian composer using Ukrainian traditional village music. It's a beautiful piece of music, but I get your point entirely. Just before our last little discussion, in which I want to talk about your work, particularly when we talk about your country, one last question I have for you is, and again, maybe it's just because it's been the holiday season, but your wish list to Santa. So Santa, this is the Ukraine that I would like to see when the war is over.
Ukraine, like I said, with many different voices that can tell their stories. A Ukraine where coexistence is possible, where when we can talk about our pain freely without being censored, and we can also talk about each other without stereotypes and without falling back on the old Soviet narratives, because that also influences a lot in our discourse. And of course, just the Ukraine that's blossoming, that's flourishing, where you can discover many new artists, many new voices, and it's extraordinary that you can do it now. But to see that even more and even outside the borders of Ukraine, that's my wish too. I think I would like Ukraine to be known on its own, not in relationship to Russia or not in relationship to the war. And I think that's, once again, I go back to the idea that I said, I discovered Ukraine as an adult already. And what I discovered was just completely overwhelming in its excitement and its richness, its incredible cultural legacy. So I would like that to be Ukraine's story. But honestly, my biggest wish is simply that Ukraine can maintain itself and maintain its unity too. Because unless we're united and unless we work together and support each other, it cannot be in any other way.
Yeah, and divide and conquer has always been the technique of Ukraine's enemies, in particular Moscow, is to pit one group of Ukrainian against another Ukrainian, empowering people throughout Ukraine's history who say that they are the ones who get to define who is a good Ukrainian, who's a bad Ukrainian. That's been a tactic that's been used, and I see that having been very much diminished during this period of war. We're all Ukrainians. We're all Ukrainians. I hear that time and time again. And I hope it stays. And I have cautious optimism, and I've been accused of being an optimist in the past before, but I'm gonna keep being an optimist. And I think Ukraine, after this war, will stay Ukraine, and Ukrainians will stay together. And I think that there's a very, very bright future for Ukraine after the end of the war. and talking about the future. And now you had your book that came out 2014.
The book came out in 2022, so
22.
Started working in it in 2014. By the time I finished it, it was 2021. And essentially, it came out in different translations. It's been translated into 18 languages, and now including Ukrainian, which is very special for me.
How's the reaction been in Ukraine?
It has not come out yet, but the early reviews have been very encouraging and positive. So I'm very happy. It feels like, part of me is coming home. So it's a very special experience. But basically, my point is that this book is about Ukrainian identity and also me coming to terms with that. Mm-hmm. How does the Soviet past affect our identity, and how do we make our own future, regardless of whatever baggage the past left us?
Well, we have something in common in that case then, because the entire purpose of this program that I've put together is to platform Ukrainian voices so that people can understand who are these people, these Ukrainians, and why are they fighting so hard for their country, and what does their country mean to them, and what does their identity mean to them. And your book does that very well. It's the Rooster House, and you can get it, wherever you get your good books. Of course, there's always the massive conglomerate of Amazon. I'm sure you can get it there. But if you can get it from your local bookshop or a little seller, then that would be great too. You're working on a new book?
Yes, I'm working on a new book, okay, which is really more about how cultural heritage gets preserved during war. In fact, I started this topic also in 2014. It was a very prolific year for me in many ways, but not in Ukraine. I was in northern India at the time and traveling and researching local crafts and how craftsmen preserve their traditions. And at the time, it was also in northern India, very difficult, volatile time. Kashmir lost its autonomy, and seeing people still preserving and carry on, weaving pashminas and embroidering was just so somehow strange in that environment. But then you talk to people, you realize, well, this is part of who we are. So if we don't preserve it, what is the point? We absolutely have to preserve it. And that experience was very thought-provoking for me. And as I traveled, I started looking for similar ideas and similar mechanisms. When I came back to Ukraine in 2024, I almost immediately kind of fell into the community of artists, of people who create perfumes, who embroider, who paint, who write. And
have you got a Vyshyvanka?
Of course.
I appreciate your time. Again, the book, The Rooster House, it will give you an insight into Ukraine, into a traditional Ukrainian family. Not to diminish in any way your story, but an average family.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
is your story, your family's story. Again, not to diminish, it's not particularly unique. It is a Ukrainian story. So to try and understand Ukrainians, it is a wonderful entry. It is a wonderful window, a look into who are these people?
And I think also part of the book and part of the reason it resonated so well is that it's also a story of a country, a family, of community. What happens when the trauma is basically silenced and covered over? And it's not surprising that I had the best response from readers from countries that have experienced violence and trauma, whether we're talking about South America, Latin America, or Spain, Catalonia especially, because the book appeared in Catalan and in Spanish. And it's very similar mechanism. Again, we come back to trauma. When trauma is not processed, it does not go away, but basically creates these very additional trauma, additional scars, and how people live with it, how they inherit it, what they make with it, that becomes basically part of the story, and it really affects people's perceptions of themselves, of their place in the society. Sometimes, that's not necessarily all negative, but it's just a fact. It has a very serious consequences.
Well, from your, stockroom in Belgium to some of the habits that I have, because my mother was a child of the Great Depression, and she was also a bit of a food hoarder and dealt with money and things like that very differently, and that definitely was passed on down to me. So these things do get passed on, but ultimately, I am convinced that Ukraine's future is bright. When this war ends, I have every faith in the Ukrainian people, despite their trauma, despite everything that they've been through and the difficulties and the hurdles and the schisms and the fighting and everything that's going to come after the shooting stops. The second half of the musical Hamilton is not about the American Revolution. It's about creating the American nation. So that's going to be the next chapter for you and your country. And I'm looking forward to the literature that comes out from that period of time when Ukraine is finally free and can start to build itself.
I agree with you. I agree with you that, there are causes for optimism. Sometimes, when I'm too long inside Ukraine, I kind of absorbed everyone's attitude, and it also colors mine. So, but once I leave and I process and basically start to count down days to the next time I can return to Ukraine, then I always feel a little this kind of boost. I like talking to people who are optimistic. It's extremely therapeutic too.
I'm also often seen as a kind of a foolish, you foolish foreigner. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what the hurdles are. I think in some ways, and they may be right, my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, but in some ways, as a foreigner looking in, I may be able to see some things that Ukrainians don't see. And again, maybe it's that fatalism or that pessimism or the history of trauma or the current trauma that people are going through. But I have great faith and belief in the people of Ukraine. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. And I know that someday, and it may not be tomorrow, and it may not be, I don't know how long it's going to take. But I am convinced that at some point in this country's near future that prosperity is going to happen, happiness will return. And I think once you're free of the empire and you're able to create that new country, this new thing on the global stage called Ukraine, which has been absolutely created through just some of the worst pain that a nation can go through. But to survive it and to finally be free, I think the world is going to be astounded by what Ukraine is able to do. So I am glad that you are writing about this. I'm glad that you are putting it out to audiences. I hope it is very well received in Ukraine. I suspect it will be. And Victoria Belim, I appreciate your time that you've spent with us today. And if you have any other thing that we have not discussed that you would like to tell my audience, now is the time.
Just thank you for your support and for your Phil, for everyone who's listening. I think that's the most precious thing. I think without support of my readers, and most of my readers are in the US, after all, without their support, their constant messages, I don't think I would be able to go through, doing what I'm doing these past 8 months. So that's been absolutely precious and incredible. And in many ways, when I approach things, I also find this, kind of American upbringing in me. Just there is nothing that's impossible. There is just you have to try it and you have to go for it. And I think that's a very, very positive and important part of my American experience. It's kind of my American identity.
I think it's infectious, and I think I see a lot of similarities between our two countries, and I think we're going to be great friends. And I am extremely optimistic, despite a lot of things. Regardless, I'm very, very optimistic.
And thank you for that.
All right. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.